I'm not sure when I stopped believing in miracles, but it was around the time I realized my family wasn't the fairy tale I'd hoped it would be. My father, Charles, was a quiet man who rarely let his emotions show. My biological mother, Eloise, left us shortly after I turned 6, lured away by a new love interest. Back then, I didn't fully understand what it meant to have one parent choose a new life over ours, but I do remember the sting of her absence. Then Caroline came along, my stepmother, with a warm laugh, keen intelligence, and a heart big enough to embrace me as her own. From the start, Caroline insisted I call her by her first name, never forcing me to see her as a replacement. She said, "I'm here to love you, not to erase your mother." She was the one who showed up to school plays, who drove me to dentist appointments, and who listened when I was too upset to speak. She simply made space in her life for a child who wasn't hers. In hindsight, I might have sensed that unconditional devotion could never last, but I still believed in happy endings then. Caroline had once been a teacher, but she quit after a chemical plant accident left her seriously injured. The company responsible tried to cover its tracks, but she fought back in court. For 2 years, she dealt with hearings, paperwork, and depositions that made her relive the trauma. I never saw anyone determined. When the judgment finally came, she was awarded a $1 million settlement. Instead of spending it on lavish vacations or cars, she used it wisely. Some went to medical expenses and physical therapy she needed to recover. Another portion was set aside in a trust fund for me and for the 2 children Caroline had from her previous marriage. She believed that education and a secure future were the best gifts she could give us. For a while, everything felt hopeful. My father wasn't the type to celebrate outwardly, but I saw relief in his eyes. Caroline's settlement took a weight off his shoulders. He was proud of her fight, admired her tenacity, and he treated her like a queen, pulling out chairs for her, planting kisses on her cheek when they thought no one was looking. They seemed, in every sense, a team, bound by loyalty and love. Then came the diagnosis. Caroline complained of pain, and at first, everyone assumed it was linked to her old injuries. But the tests revealed something far more insidious, a malignant tumor in her pancreas. The prognosis was grim. She tried chemotherapy, alternative therapies, anything that held even a whisper of hope, but nothing stopped the disease from spreading. I was 17 by then, old enough to understand that she wouldn't beat this thing by willpower alone. Still, I couldn't accept the idea of losing her. My father tried to remain stoic, but I saw cracks in his composure. Late at night, I'd pass his room and hear him praying or sometimes weeping softly. He became Caroline's fiercest protector, reading every article on experimental treatments and contacting specialists across the country. For a while, she seemed to rally, laughing through her pain, forcing herself to eat, and whispering, "I'm okay, kiddo," whenever she caught me staring. But within a few months, her condition worsened. I can still recall the night she asked to speak to me alone. She looked so fragile, curled on the living room couch, eyes distant with fear. She told me she wanted to make sure her affairs were in order. She told me about the trust fund she'd created, one that guaranteed my education would be covered. "I won't be around to see you graduate, but you'll have everything you need," she said, her voice quivering. I tried to protest, insisting she'd still be here, but she just shook her head, forcing a smile. Over the following weeks, she had a lawyer finalize the documents. She left instructions for me, her sons, and even for my father, although he was too haunted by the looming void to pay much attention. That was when my biological mother re-entered our lives in the most unexpected way. One day, she just appeared on our doorstep, wearing a tight dress and an apologetic smile. She claimed she'd found renewed feelings for my father. It was surreal. Dad had never spoken kindly of her after she left, so I was shocked he even let her in. But grief does strange things, and maybe he was desperate for comfort. She began visiting regularly, at first to pay her respects to Caroline, then to keep my father company whenever Caroline was too sick to leave her bed. I felt uneasy, but I didn't fully grasp her agenda yet. Within weeks, my mother, Eloise, had inserted herself into almost every aspect of our home life. She would bring over groceries or cook meals, always smiling at my father as if they'd never spent a decade apart. Caroline, weakened by her illness, rarely protested, but I caught flashes of sorrow in her eyes. I remember one afternoon when Caroline tried to sit at the kitchen table, only for Eloise to swoop in, urging her to rest. It looked like concern, but something in her tone felt possessive. I confronted my father, asking if he believed my mother had shown up to rekindle an old flame. He dismissed me, blaming my anxiety on Caroline's condition. "Your mother regrets leaving," he said, "and she wants to make amends." But I wasn't convinced. I'd overheard Eloise on the phone talking in hushed tones about legal stuff and a financial plan. When I pressed my ear closer to the door, she'd quickly hang up. She started inviting my father out to dinners alone, claiming Caroline needed quiet. While I resented it, I was also afraid to stress Caroline further. So I stayed quiet, hoping my instincts were wrong. But deep down, I knew better. When Caroline's health took a decline, our house became a hospice. Nurses came and went, administering painkillers and checking her vitals. My father drifted through the days like a ghost, consumed by fear and guilt. Eloise, meanwhile, seized every opportunity to support him, arms draped around his shoulders, whispers in his ear. I'd catch them in the living room, her hand on his knee, as if she already considered herself mistress of the house. Caroline noticed, of course, but she was too exhausted to confront it. One evening, she motioned for me to sit by her bed. "Look out for your dad," she murmured, each word a labored breath. "He's not strong like you." Tears blurred my vision. I promised to protect him, even though I was uncertain how. A few nights later, when Caroline passed away, she did so in the quiet darkness, holding my father's hand. Grief enveloped us, but it seemed to propel Eloise even deeper into our family dynamic. She organized Caroline's funeral as though it were her project. She wore a dress and accepted condolences by my father's side. Even then, I could sense her eagerness to assume a role that was never meant for her. In the weeks that followed, Eloise officially moved into our home. She claimed it was only temporary, to help my father cope with loneliness. Yet, I noticed she was quick to redecorate, removing Caroline's favorite paintings and rearranging furniture. One day, I found her rummaging through Caroline's personal papers. When I asked what she was doing, she smiled sweetly. "Just trying to organize things," she said, acting as if rifling through the private belongings of a dead woman was normal. I decided to read the trust fund documents Caroline left for me. She had stipulated that I would gain full control at age 21. The money was enough to cover tuition for any college I wanted, plus a little extra. That knowledge felt like a lifeline, a reminder that Caroline hadn't abandoned me, even in death. But it also meant there was something Eloise might want. I overheard her telling my father about merging finances and how it was important to plan for the future. He shrugged it off, not realizing she was inching closer to controlling Caroline's settlement. I knew I had to act, but I was still a minor under my father's guardianship. So I waited, gathering information. Over the next year, Eloise solidified her hold on my father. She convinced him to marry her again, citing companionship and the need for a stable household. I was almost 18 when they eloped at City Hall with only a few acquaintances present. I felt betrayed that he wouldn't consult me, but I kept my head down, determined not to give Eloise the satisfaction of drama. I focused on finishing high school and planning for college. Behind the scenes, I checked the trust fund's legal stipulations. It was airtight. Caroline had named me the sole beneficiary. That meant Eloise couldn't touch it unless I allowed her to. Still, she tried. She began planting ideas in my father's head about how we should unify our finances for tax benefits. She also suggested that I didn't really need such a large fund for college, that we could invest in a family business. My father echoed her words, albeit hesitantly. He'd say, "She's only trying to help us all succeed." But I recognized the masked greed in her eyes. Every time I refused, she pouted or threw a tantrum. My father pleaded with me, but I stood my ground, remembering Caroline's final wish. My 18th birthday arrived with little fanfare. Eloise didn't even bother with a cake. My father, seeming apologetic, gave me a subdued birthday card with $50 tucked inside. I smiled politely, but I sensed he felt torn between us. Over time, Eloise's manipulations had worn him down, and the man who once stood by Caroline's side now seemed like a shell of himself. Despite the tension, I managed to graduate with honors. On commencement day, I spotted Eloise wearing a smug grin, as though she wanted to take credit for my achievements. I saw my father offering me a weak thumbs up, but all I could really think about was Caroline. She should have been there. She was the one who believed in my potential long before anyone else did. Soon after, I left for college. I used the first installment of the trust fund to cover tuition and housing. Escaping that house felt like a liberation. I limited contact with Eloise and spoke to my father only when necessary. For a moment, I thought I could finally breathe. But Eloise was cunning. She knew she couldn't legally force me to share the trust, so she tried emotional manipulation instead. Ignoring my request for space, she and my father visited my dorm unannounced. They brought takeout and forced smiles, saying they wanted a family meal. Once inside, Eloise pretended to be affectionate and proud. She asked for a tour, prying into every detail of my life, who my friends were, my class schedule, how I was spending money. Finally, she sat me down and offered a proposition. "If you let your dad and I invest a part of your fund," she said, "we can guarantee a bigger return. Think about your future. A house, a car." She even suggested she and my father could manage the money until I turned 21, as if I couldn't handle it on my own. My father chimed in, his tone full of rehearsed sincerity. "We only want what's best for you." I felt my fists clench. I told them no. Eloise's fake smile wavered. She tried to coax me, then guilt-trip me, then angrily accuse me of being selfish. My father looked torn, but he didn't defend me. I realized then that he had become Eloise's puppet. She stormed out, calling me ungrateful. In that moment, I vowed never to yield to her demands. As months passed, Eloise intensified her efforts. She'd call me at odd hours, leaving voicemails about family obligations and how I was hurting my father by withholding funds. Sometimes she'd hint that Caroline would have wanted me to share. The audacity of twisting Caroline's memory enraged me. I saved every voicemail, forwarding them to a separate folder as evidence. Meanwhile, I immersed myself in academics, determined to graduate early. I worked part-time and spent my free hours in the library. My grades soared, and I joined campus organizations, forging friendships that felt more genuine than anything at home. Still, a part of me ached for a real father, not the broken man tethered to Eloise's schemes. One weekend, I returned home to gather some clothes. The house looked different, with new curtains, new furniture, Eloise's touch everywhere. I found my room half converted into a storage space. Rage pulsed through me, but I remained calm. I noticed unopened mail addressed to me stuffed in a drawer. Bills, statements, important documents Eloise had intercepted. She was rummaging in my financial life, hoping to find a weak spot. I gathered everything and left without a word, realizing she was preparing for a final push. That final push came in the form of a lawsuit. A month before my 19th birthday, I received official papers stating that my father and Eloise were challenging the validity of Caroline's trust. They claimed Caroline was mentally incompetent when she created it and that I'd manipulated her. My hands shook as I read the allegations, each more absurd than the last. They wanted the court to dissolve the trust, effectively transferring the funds to my father as my legal guardian. I felt a sickening mix of betrayal and fury. This was no longer a question of family disagreements, it was war. I hired a lawyer, using some of the trust money to protect the rest. I presented my evidence. Caroline's meticulous paperwork, medical records proving her sound mind at the time, and even recordings of her expressing her clear intentions. My lawyer assured me we had a strong case. Still, the legal battle threatened to drag on, draining my energy and finances. Eloise smeared my name in the community. She told neighbors I was a greedy child refusing to support my father in his old age. I refused to buckle, fueled by anger and the memory of Caroline's kindness. The court proceedings stretched across several miserable months. My father barely looked at me in the courtroom, while Eloise flaunted a crocodile grin. She testified that Caroline's mental state was compromised by her medications. She even claimed Caroline disliked me, an outrageous lie that left my blood boiling. My lawyer countered by summoning Caroline's doctor, who confirmed that Caroline was lucid and capable of managing her finances. We also presented letters Caroline had written to me, referencing the trust and her hopes for my future. Eventually, the judge ruled in my favor. The trust stood. Eloise's claim was denied, and my father's guardianship over me was deemed irrelevant since I was now 18. Relief washed over me, but anger lingered. Their betrayal demanded retribution, something more than a legal victory. I wanted them to feel the sting of consequences. I met with my lawyer again, explaining I wanted to file a countersuit for the emotional distress and legal costs I'd incurred. It was an aggressive move, but I refused to play the docile child any longer. My lawyer warned me it might escalate tensions, but I didn't care. I wanted them to pay for what they'd done to Caroline's memory. The countersuit sent Eloise into panic mode. My father called me late one night, begging me to reconsider. He cried, claiming he never wanted to sue me in the first place, but I refused to back down. The legal system was slower than I'd like, but eventually, Eloise agreed to settle. My lawyer negotiated a deal that forced them to pay my legal fees and publicly retract their accusations in a written statement. Eloise fumed, but she had no choice. Her lies had been exposed, and continuing the fight would only deepen her losses. When I read their retraction, a sense of triumph washed over me. The statement apologized for the false claims regarding Caroline's competency and admitted there was no evidence I manipulated her. I had won, but my heart still felt raw. My father's name was right there beside Eloise's, implicating him in all her deceit. It was a final confirmation that he'd chosen her over me and over Caroline's dying wishes. I didn't attend the settlement hearing in person. I let my lawyer finalize the documents. Once it was all signed, I took a deep breath and realized I felt strangely calm, as though a chapter had ended. I withdrew from their lives completely. I changed my phone number and asked campus security to bar them from visiting. Eloise tried emailing me, but I blocked her address. I kept my father at a distance too. He'd made his choice. Over time, I funneled my rage into building a future worthy of Caroline's belief in me. I graduated college with honors, pursued a master's degree, and found a job that let me use my trust fund to help others. Though I sometimes wonder if my father regrets what he did, I've never offered forgiveness. He stood by Eloise when she desecrated Caroline's memory. He tried to steal what Caroline fought so hard to provide. In my book, that's unforgivable. As for Eloise, she vanished from my radar, presumably off scheming someone else. I take a satisfaction in knowing she lost her legal battles and any claim to my life. Occasionally, I visit Caroline's grave, placing flowers by her headstone. I whisper my gratitude, telling her she was right. I am strong enough to defend myself, to survive betrayal, and to walk away unbroken. The trust she gave me wasn't just financial, it was the power to stand tall.